call Julian Ginter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Green Party is supporting the taxation annual rates for 2015-16 Research and Development and Remedial Matters Bill. And I'll speak to the part that we're particularly excited about because it really does pick up a key plank of Green Party policy and reverses the government's policy up until now. When the government first came into office, they cancelled the tax credits for research and development that had been instituted by the previous government. Even though there was every sign that they were working quite well, in New Zealand, we have a lot of research which says that we're underinvested in research and development. Our companies tend not to spend as much money on research and development as companies in other comparable countries that we would aspire to be more like. And that's one of the things that's holding back our economic prosperity, if you will, in the world. So there's a great book, actually, which I highly recommend to anyone watching this speech tonight called Get Off the Grass. And it was co-authored by Sir Paul Callaghan and Sean Hendy, who's a professor at the University of Auckland. And it's all about how to kickstart New Zealand's innovation economy. And it starts out by identifying a number of myths about what it is that creates the conditions for sustainable economic prosperity. And in New Zealand, we have a lot of myths which are perpetuated by the current government, which are that New Zealand's terribly overburdened in tax and we've got too much regulatory burden, and what we really need to do are cut regulations, cut taxes, and we're going to get richer. But if we look at all the comparable countries in the world who have higher incomes per capita than New Zealand, they actually don't have lower tax rates. They don't have less regulatory regime. It's not easier to start up businesses in those countries. We have one of the most liberalized economies in the world, and yet we've still lagged behind on incomes per capita. And so the question is, why is that? Is it possible that those myths around the barriers to New Zealand's economic prosperity are actually wrong? And what we do need to do is build on our competitive advantage, which is our clean green brand. So while the current government thinks that we have to choose between the economy and the environment, the truth is we cannot choose between those two. We cannot get richer by mining, polluting, and using up more of our natural resources. In the long term, we will be poorer for doing that. So the Green Party has an evidence-based economic strategy which builds on protecting our natural resources and protecting our environment. Not only because it's going to be good for us in the medium and long term, and because it's going to mean New Zealanders can live better lives, but also just because we do love our environment, and we know most New Zealanders love our environment. So what is the evidence base? The evidence base, and I'm going to cite Sir Paul Callaghan and Sean Hendy on this, is that we need to create the conditions for more innovation in New Zealand. And one of the most simple ways to do that is through something like research and development tax credit. This government, when they came in, they canceled the research and development tax credits, and then they set up the Callaghan Innovation to try and direct money to incentivize research and development. But the problem is the way that Callaghan Innovation is working is it isn't the most simple system. It doesn't reward all businesses equally for investing in research and development. It has a huge bureaucratic burden which makes it easier for the big players to apply for grants and get grants, but makes it very, very difficult for small companies and startups to get the benefit of investing in research and development because they have to have this incredible infrastructure in place to be able to apply. And of course, there's another problem, which is that Callaghan Innovation has been a little bit, I would say, politically influenced. At least that has been the criticism from a lot of researchers working here in New Zealand. So, for example, a CRI GNS applied for a grant to, it was through Trans-Tasman Resources, which is a majority foreign-owned company with a former Prime Minister as a board member, received a big grant from Callaghan Innovation to attempt to mine the iron sands in the habitats and feeding grounds of Maui's dolphins and blue whales. So not only are we not using Callaghan Innovation to pick winners that might have some positive externalities. It seems that the current government is using Callahan innovation to pick winners that do the exact opposite, which is increase environmental degradation and rely and basically incentivize an extractive approach, which is never, and we should know this from looking at our our comparable countries overseas, that an extractive approach can never build long-term prosperity. But if we take another country, which is very similar to New Zealand in size, Denmark, admittedly located in the center of Europe, but similar size population, and similarly to us, they had an economy that was almost entirely reliant on simple commodity exports, primarily agriculture. And what Denmark did over a period of a couple of decades is apply a whole set of policies which incentivized local value-added economic development. And now Denmark has much higher incomes per capita than New Zealand. They're also reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, and they're also achieving a lot, have much lower levels of child poverty than New Zealand. So they're able to do all of this. And when you look at a graph of their exports, it's really fascinating because you can see that agriculture remains a very large portion of their exports. The overall size and value of their agricultural exports hasn't changed much over that period. It's slightly declined. But they've added all of these value-added sectors, high value, IT, clothing, manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, a whole lot of other layers on top of it, and they've almost doubled their exports and their GDP. So when the Green Party says, we cannot have an economic strategy that relies on doubling our production of dairy because our environment's simply not going to cope with it, and also it's not going to make us better off. The profitability isn't going to increase at the same rate. You get diminishing marginal returns. We're not saying that we abandon agriculture completely. We're saying we can add all of these other areas. And in order to do that, we need to have a comprehensive policy. So right before the last election, the Green Party announced a suite of policies that were aimed at incentivizing a transition to a clean, green economy. One that is going to enable all New Zealanders to be better off, for us to reduce our carbon pollution, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, which is going to be a winning economic strategy in the long term, and a winning survival strategy, which is also good. And one of the planks of that was a huge R&D package, which included tax credits for research and development, such as are contained in this bill, and also incredibly important to not only provide the carrot, but to also ensure that the ground rules are in place, because regulations are one of the biggest drivers of innovation. So our climate tax cut, for example, would put a price on carbon pollution at a manageable level. We'd be indicating that there'd be an independent climate commission who'd be overseeing setting the price in future years, but business would have the clear price signal that they need to invest for the long term in clean, green, low carbon technology. And so by putting that price on carbon, we're sending in a signal to the market. And yes, it might be true that it costs some jobs in highly polluting industries, but what the government never talks about is that incentive, that regulation, that price signal actually creates jobs in clean, green industries. And that's exactly what we want here in New Zealand. So you've got the carrot, if you will, the R&D tax credits, the direct investment in research and development, setting up a green investment bank, which would be a low-cost way of setting up a fully commercial bank, which would have specialty and would specialize and have expertise in clean tech, which would facilitate the private sector investments in those areas. And then we've got the carbon price, which is not kept by government, but actually recycled back to households and businesses in the form of a tax cut from the bottom, so that all people equally benefit from it. And so that is the kind of evidence-based, practical policy that the Green Party is proposing, so that we can have a long-term, sustainable future for all New Zealanders. And we're happy to see that the government's picked up one small part of that in this bill, and that's why we'll be supporting it. And we look forward to them picking up more of our policy in the future.
I call Fletcher Tabuto.
Speaker,